Good morning. We're going to continue with chapter 12, Isabella with her prayers. There's some little bit of movement here. Let me see if I can deal with that. Again, we're using a different apparatus today. I appreciate you. Thank you for being with me today. Chapter 12, Isabella with her prayers. She with her prayers, he with many armed men. Juan del Encina on Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. It was in April 1492 at Santa Fe, an encampment outside the recently conquered Moorish town of Granada, that Christopher Columbus received the final agreement to explore the New World. He set off a few months later. Columbus was granted the vital backing by a woman as well as by a man, by Isabella of Castile as well as Ferdinand of Aragon, for the two were independent monarchs and had been so since the inception of their reigns. Their extraordinary partnership had lasted 20-odd years so far. Instead of confirming Isabella as a typically devout and secluded Spanish princess, leaving the sphere of action to her dominant warrior husband, the passage of time had actually transformed her. To the Pope himself, Ferdinand and Isabella were jointly the Catholic kings, and in a phrase euphonious to modern ears, the athletes of Christ. In the forging of this partnership, both destiny and the laws of inheritance played their role, and so did the necessity for armed conflict, which preoccupied the royal pair from the earliest moment of their joint reign in Castile. A contemporary, Juan del Encina, described the relative contribution of Ferdinand and Isabella to their conquests in their conventional terms. They fought, she with her prayers and he with many armed men. But while in no way deriding the efficacy of Isabella's prayers, a subject about which no positive information can be garnered, one must also note that she made a public contribution to their victories, which puts her in a unique category in this book, the warrior queen as partner. Moreover, the queen's military fervor and the calls of right both nurtured her marriage to Ferdinand and was in turn nurtured by it. Her crusades, jointly carried out with her husband, took on some of the sacramental nature of marriage itself in the eyes of a deeply religious woman. As for her contemporary reputation, the decorous wifeliness with which she conducted herself within this partnership earned general approval. At the end of the chapter, This approval will be contrasted with the disapproval shown to Caterina Forza, a would-be warrior queen, who was neither decorous nor wifely. Queen Elizabeth was a woman of 41. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. Queen Isabella was a woman of 41 with 12 more years to live. When Columbus was authorized to return to the Indies and supervise the preserving and peopling of them, because thereby our Lord God is served, his holy faith extended, and our realms increased. She was, in fact, born in the same year as Columbus himself. King Ferdinand was a year younger. With hindsight, this patronage of Columbus, resulting in the European discovery of America, can be seen as the Spanish king's most resonant achievement, but the endless sound waves which would flow from this decision were hardly foreseen at the time. Ferdinand and Isabella had already presided over one dazzlingly successful crusade to restore the Moorish kingdom to Catholic Spain. After 8 centuries, at the insistence of their religious advisors. It's okay, baby. Hey, it's okay. They're not coming for us. We parked too close to the bathroom. That's on us. Okay, thank you. Ferdinand and Isabella had already presided over one dazzlingly successful crusade to restore the Moorish kingdom to Catholic Spain after 8 centuries. At the insistence of their religious advisors, they would promulgate a further internal crusade, less dazzling because less practically beneficial, to expel the Jews along with the Muslims. The relative importance and approval which history would give to these respective crusades would have been incomprehensible to Queen Isabella. The denizens of one age rarely comprehending the apparently weird standards of another. To modern appraisers, the protective attitude of Ferdinand and Isabella toward their new Indian subjects. What does he, Columbus, think he is doing with my vassals? Isabella is supposed to have asked, contrasts most favorably with their chilling attitude to the Jews, who had been citizens of Spain for centuries. After 1492, the latter, if they failed to convert, were cast out, according to the priest chronicler Bernaldez. Okay, hang on, let me touch my phone. It's gonna make it move. Okay, sorry about that. Alright, you're on page 184. They, the Jews, went out from the land of their birth, boys and adults, old men and children, on foot and riding on donkeys and other beasts in wagons. They went by the roads and fields with much excuse me, Lord. They went by the roads and fields with much labor and ill fortune, some collapsing, others getting up, some dying, others giving birth, others falling ill, so that there was no Christian who was not sorry for them. The rabbis were encouraging them and making the women and boys sing and beat drums and tambourines to enliven the people. And so they went out of Castile. The sun is right smack in my eyeballs. I can take my glasses off, that would help. Similarly, the Moors, who were originally granted generous terms after the fall of Granada in the same year, including their own laws, their own religion, and their own dress, ended by being expelled in their turn if they did not accept conversion. In 1487, during the series of campaigns known as the Reconquista, Queen Isabella had given money for the Moors to be reclothed in the Castilian fashion as a propaganda exercise. In 1508, 4 years after her death, Moorish dress in a final insult suggesting the total suppression of a culture was prohibited altogether. To Isabella herself, however, the need for religious unity in Spain put these expulsions on quite a different level from the protection a sovereign must accord to distant subjects. Religious unity cannot easily be criticized as an objective by those who live in a world of mutually repellent secular orthodoxies, quite as compelling and all-inclusive in their claims, wrote J.N. Hilgoth in 1978. It is an apt comment. Nevertheless, many manage to do so. Oh my goodness, with that light. Right in my eyes. To Isabella herself, however, the need for religious unity in Spain put these expulsions on quite a different level from the protection a sovereign must accord to distant subjects. Furthermore, the expulsions were recommended by her rigorous confessors, including the formidable bigoted cardinal known as Eximes or Francisco de Cisneros. This was a woman who stepped out of the role expected of her sex in one direction. She had become a public crusade, expressing such male sentiments as, "Glory is not to be won without danger." One can understand how she might compensate for this in another direction by extreme spiritual humility in private and devotion to the will of her male religious advisors. In the earlier years of her reign, such complications were not evident. Other perils had to be faced, and Isabella's personal crusading impulse, the product of faith and determination, was not only approved by her contemporaries, but also seen as a holy destiny, which might be implicit in the union of the crowns of Aragon and Castile. With this conjuncture of two royal scepters, wrote Bernaldez, our Lord Jesus Christ took vengeance on his enemies and destroyed him who slays and curses. First, before that destiny could be accomplished, Ferdinand and Isabella had to destroy those who threatened to slay them, or at least rebelled vigorously against Isabella's succession to the throne of Castile. It was the death of Isabella's half-brother, Henry IV, son of John II of Castile by his first marriage, in 1474, which provoked this crisis. Although he had acknowledged Isabella as his heir, Henry IV did have a daughter of his own. This girl, however, was reputedly illegitimate. Either the king was impotent or his wife was wanton, or both. Her nickname, Juana la Beltraneja, making scornful reference to her supposed conception by Don Beltran de la Cueva, whatever the truth of Juana's legitimacy. There were plenty of potentates who seized the opportunity of backing her in their own interests, particularly since she was unmarried, her hand bringing with it the possibility of the Spanish throne. Isabella's own husband, Ferdinand, whom she had married 5 years earlier, also had a claim to the throne, since he too had his place in the Castilian succession. Isabella and Ferdinand were second cousins. It is true that the royal house of Aragon was only a minor branch of that of Castile, but then he was a man. This was more relevant in Aragon, there where the Salic law operated, that law originating in France in the early 14th century, which precluded females from the royal succession, than in neighboring Castile, where it did not. Nor had Ferdinand in his marriage treaty of 1469 pressed his public claims unduly. At that date, securing marriage to the heiress Isabella from his own lesser position had been the prime consideration. As it happened, Isabella was in Segovia when her brother died, while Ferdinand was away campaigning for his father, the King of Aragon. It was in order to cope with the threat of Juana's pretensions, she being temporarily captive to a Castilian noble, that Isabella immediately had herself proclaimed Reina Proprietaria, Queen Proprietress. She also had herself crowned, still in Ferdinand's absence, and she had the unsheathed sword of justice carried before her at the ceremony, a revival of an ancient practice, it is true, but one that had never been performed for a female monarch before. Ferdinand, when he heard the news, is said to have cried out publicly, "Tell me, you who have read so many histories, did you ever hear of carrying the symbol of life and death before queens? I have known it only of kings." All this was, however, directed by Isabella, rather against Juana and her supporters than against Ferdinand, her husband. In addition, the proud Castilian nobility would not welcome subjugation to an Aragonese Isabella's personal proprietorship of the crown, regardless of her sex, also carried an important point of principle with it for the future, as she pointed out to Ferdinand. Supposing their own surviving child or children were also female, this was the actual case during the early years of Isabella's reign, and would also, incidentally, be the case at her death. If Isabella's personal hereditary right in Castile was not acknowledged, then the princess, our daughter's right, would be similarly endangered at her mother's death. In effect, Ferdinand did always act as co-ruler with Isabella. Proclamations in Castile were probably from the very first in their joint names. Both their effigies were displayed on Castilian coins, whereas when Ferdinand succeeded to his father's throne of Aragon in 1479, where the Salic law ran, Isabella was merely entitled his queen consort. Gradually, as the years passed and the marriage, the partnership of state, flourished, rights and titles in both countries were ignored in favor of the delights of joint rule. The deliberate impression was given of Ferdinand and Isabella sharing a single mind. The fact that the Castilian castles and the Castilian crown revenues were reserved in theory to Isabella personally, at the Queen's will alone, faded in importance compared to Ferdinand's free exercise of power in Castile. Similarly, Isabella, despite her technical position as a consort, was allowed to administer justice in Aragon. The monarchs came to resemble two great oaks whose roots were inextricably entwined somewhere below the surface. In 1474, however, the determination which this young woman of 23 displayed, far from her husband's side, was crucial in holding on to that throne of which she judged herself to be queen proprietress. She showed herself from the first a remarkable character, as well as a redoubtable one. It was not as if Isabella had been educated in any way to handle matters of state. She had been raised in virtual seclusion by her mother after her father's death when she was 3 years old, having another elder full brother who before his premature death was regarded as heir presumptive to Henry IV. The rigorous intellectual training granted to the young Elizabeth Tudor, for example, whatever the constraints of her situation, was quite absent from the upbringing of the Castilian princess. As a result, Queen Isabella set herself much later to learn Latin, the language of diplomacy and statecraft, in order to talk to foreign dignitaries, a decision which will earn the sympathy of all those deprived of necessary languages in resilient youth, and condemned to learn them in far less elastic middle age. Excuse me. Whew. In urging on the production of a Castilian Latin dictionary, she would observe that it was necessary because women too often learned their Latin from men. Her own daughters, including Catherine of Aragon, were notably well instructed by the great Spanish educationalist Vives. The obsessive education of daughters is often the sign of a mother who has regretted her own deprivation in that sphere. Nor was there any sign of the tomboy syndrome here in childhood. No tales of a childish Isabella riding freely in the forest. No comparisons to Camilla of the Volsci. Once again, it was in later years that Isabella had herself instructed in those martial arts and exercises that she would have learned in childhood had she been born a prince rather than a princess. Yet in another way, Isabella's enclosed upbringing, coupled with the subsequent scandals centered round the name of Henry IV's queen and the disputed birth of Juana la Beltranca, had left a deep mark upon her. The pious austerity for which she was renowned must surely be ascribed not only to a natural inclination in that direction, but also to an awareness of the dangers brought to a queen expected to be the bearer of a royal family by incontinent sexuality. Isabella's 19th century biographer, W.H. Prescott, whose great work can never be entirely superseded, if only for the incomparable style in which it is written, suggested that, like the lady in Milton Comus, Isabella enjoyed divine protection at the court thanks to her own virtue. So dear to heaven is saintly chastity. 1,000 livered angels lackey her, driving far off each thing of sin and guilt. Just to read like that, it has to use like a lot of upper lip and a lot of nose. Okay, I'm going to spell it. 1,000 L-I-V-E-R-I-E-D angels lackey her. Liveried. 1,000. I mean, it appears to be livered, but I'm just gonna let you guys look that up. Yeah, like a little activity and a little homework. So dear to heaven is saintly chastity. 1,000 angels lackey her, driving far off each thing of sin and guilt. Guilt's hard to say without making a funny nose, just to be fair. In the foraging of this virtue, however, childhood influences must also have played their part. Austerity in private even extended to her own personal adornment. Isabella understood perfectly well the need for public ceremonial, the jewels, the gorgeous brocades, and richly embroidered velvets, which must be draped heavily around the woman who wore the crown for Castile. Off-duty as it were, her tastes were very different. She once related to her confessor, as a matter for self-congratulation, how she had worn only a simple dress of silk with 3 gold hem bands. That was not a boast, which would have dropped easily from the lips of Queen Elizabeth I. It was appropriate, given her religious temperament, that Isabella should remain devoted to her wedded husband from the moment when, according to tradition, she instinctively picked him out from among a group of other young men crying, "That is he! That is he!" With less virtue and more human feeling, she also remained jealous of Ferdinand's numerous amours, adopting the obviously feminine role beloved of some warrior queens. Like Matilda of Tuscany, she occupied herself in embroidering Ferdinand's shirts, as though the flashing needle might weave him closer to her side. It was not to be. Unfortunately for Isabella, Ferdinand's own natural inclinations were very far from lying in the same chaste direction. Isabella's portraits show her with a long nose and a down-turned mouth, characteristics not likely to inspire fidelity in one predisposed to philander. Portraits of Isabella's daughter Catherine of Aragon, in a time of youth and hope, show a certain similarity, although the expression is much softer and the mouth turns upwards. Catherine's unhappy daughter, Queen Mary Tudor, on the other hand, displays quite a marked resemblance to her grandmother, including the same glum expression. According to the evidence of their respective suits of armor, Isabella was also taller than Ferdinand by as much as an inch, a superiority not always welcome, even in a royal wife. Yet in real life, whatever her physical imperfections, Isabella must have been endowed with charm as well as authority. For goodness does radiate its own kind of charm. Her famous virtue, the key to the generally pure tone of her court, never mind the Aragonese king's very different attitudes, was much praised. The chronicler Bernaldez called her a fine example of a good wife. Isabella, like another virtuous sovereign, Tamara of Georgia, also had her bards protesting their respectful passion. The famous chastity did not preclude such ardent literary offerings as this, probably by Alvaro Bezan, which made of the queen the object of a cavalier's unrequited adoration. When we part, departs my heart, glory hides, sorrow abides, victory vanishes, memory languishes, and grievous smart. Even more significant were the comparisons, literary and otherwise, which made of Queen Isabella some kind of mystical figure, akin to the luminous pictures of the Blessed Virgin by Isabella's favorite Flemish artists. The poet Montoro, for example, went as far as to declare the queen worthy to have given birth to the Son of God. He was not alone in this comparison. After the restoration of southern Spain to Christianity by her agency, Isabella was frequently pictured as a second Virgin Mary, repairing the sin of Eve in the world of Fray Inigo de Mendoza. Following her death, there would be moves to canonize Isabella, moves not limited to distant times, but recurring in the 20th century. This latter-day history illustrates how close the halo always hovers above the head of the warrior queen, who has presided over a war of avowedly religious purpose, the holy armed figurehead. At the time, it was more relevant that with her authority threatened, her pretensions questioned, these comparisons undoubtedly stood Isabella herself in good practical stead. S-T-E-A-D. civil war between Isabella's supporters and those of Juana la Beltrana followed shortly after the death of King of Castile. Juana, not lost for suitors under the circumstances, became affianced to King Alfonso V of Portugal. The conflict which ensued was thus, in a sense, as much a tug of war as a civil war, since the outcome would decide whether Castile, in the future, leaned west to Portugal or east toward Aragon. It was Ferdinand, naturally, who was in charge of the prolonged military campaigning. As in Aragonese, he brought knowledge of new military techniques, as well as the possibility of northern alliances. But Isabella, as the official co-ruler and the Castilian, also had to play a figurehead's visible role as the inspiration of her party. Oh, she did more than that. Excuse me. Excuse me, Lord. All right. She did more than that. She participated personally and effectively. It may be impossible to assess the precise military achievement of Queen Isabella, due to the general rule obtaining that any female presence or initiative upon the battlefield is greeted with a special enthusiasm born out of surprise at the successful upsetting of the natural order, as when the Venetian minister Viaggio wrote that Queen Isabella, by her singular genius, masculine strength of mind, and other virtues, most unusual in our own sex as well as hers, was not merely of great assistance in but the chief cause of the conquest of Granada. Nevertheless, there is sufficient contemporary evidence to support the picture of a genuine contribution beyond those prayers which the poet juxtaposed with Ferdinand's many armed men. For one thing, it was in these first 5 years of that civil war that Isabella discovered in herself a vital capability for the organization of supplies, which complemented the gifts of her husband. It is true that Isabella deferred to her husband publicly, almost ostentatiously, on all military matters in her official guise of only a weak woman. May your lordship pardon me for speaking of things which I do not understand. She began one intervention. At the same time, she was not above employing the useful shame syndrome when necessary to secure her own way. During their reconquest of Granada, some younger nobles were trying to persuade Ferdinand to retreat against Isabella's advice. Isabella succeeded in gaining the day. The grandees, mortified at being suspended in zeal for the holy war by a woman, eagerly collected their forces over the organization of supplies, and above all in the founding of the first military hospital in Europe. The queen had less need of these tricks and ploys since supply, possibly, and nursing, certainly, were of course traditional female concerns. Isabella has been described as a great general, but an even greater quartermaster general. Pioneers in thousands were recruited by the Queen, as Bernals attests, to build roads for the passage of the guns, while it was the king who concentrated on their disposal once they arrived. It was Isabella, at the beginning of the Reconquista, who engaged Don Francisco Ramirez, known as El Artillero. He saw to it that the Castilian army was equipped with expert smiths and gunners. She approved the sending for seasoned troops in the shape of Swiss mercenaries, a very practical step. As for nursing, the equipment of the Queen's Hospital, 6 vast tents trundling from siege to siege, equipped with beds and medicines and bandages, anticipated Napoleon's ambulances by more than 200 years. Not that the soul was ignored in all this concern to heal the body. One notes that chaplains were an essential part of Isabella's hospital force, just as Mass was always celebrated in the center of the camp with prayers for victory, the altar plate being provided by the Chapel Royale, even where the mercenary Swiss were concerned. Isabella convinced herself that they were good people who only took part in wars that they believed just. From the first in the Civil War, the Queen did not spare herself. She rode hundreds of miles, often across the bleak Castilian mountain lands, pleading for support, invoking loyalty. Her early history of miscarriages must be attributed to these ordeals. This was especially unfortunate since the birth of a son would, as ever, in the case of a queen regent, have bolstered up her cause, as the birth of the future Henry II had improved the chances of the Empress Maud. In any case, a daughter could not succeed in Aragon. It was not until 1476 that Isabella's only son, Prince John, was born. One of these miscarriages occurred in the summer of 1475, after the Queen herself had taken command at Toledo, riding among her men dressed in full armor, Ferdinand being absent. Her presence, whether or not, because she was careful to end each exhortation with a prayer invoking the aid of thine arm, was said to inspire exceptional confidence. Prayer invoking the aid of thine arm was said to inspire exceptional confidence, but the welcome respite which the Queen's illness gave to her enemy Alfonso of Portugal illustrates all too neatly the unenviable fate of the warrior queen as would-be mother, a complication to which the story of Louis of Prussia will also bear testimony. The encouraging victory by which the Castilian troops recaptured the northern castle of Burgos in January 1476 was celebrated in the presence of the queen. The Castilians now needed to repossess Toro and Zamora, two fortresses on the river Douro, which controlled the route into their country from Portugal. Ferdinand, however, failed to take Zamora, and the Portuguese retreated to Toro, an apparently unassailable stronghold. Since Isabella's new baby was to be born in June, she must once more have been pregnant. Nevertheless, it is said that Isabella herself gave the courageous advice to pursue them into what might well have proved a Portuguese trap. When Toro was taken, boldness paid results. Zamora itself fell shortly afterwards. Then the baby was born, and it was a boy. The child, symbol of hope, was displayed to his people in the presence of his mother, who abandoned her preferred simplicity for such an important public occasion. The queen went capering on a white palfrey, on a very richly gilt saddle, and a very rich harness of gold and silver, and she for her dress wore brocade with many pearls of different kinds. Nor was the hope disappointed. The birth of the boy, named John after both his grandfathers, kings of Aragon and Castile, respectively, did indeed signal the decline of the Portuguese cause. Juana, the loser, ended by being locked up in a nunnery, abandoned by the rapacious King Alfonso. When Ferdinand succeeded in his turn to the throne of Aragon in 1479, the stage was set for that momentous crusade, the reconquest of the last Moorish kingdom of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella gave their own version of the motives behind the Reconquista. It was not undertaken in order to lay up treasure, for they could have stayed at home, with far less peril, travail, and expense. But the desire which we have to serve God and our zeal for the Holy Catholic faith has induced us to set aside our own interests and ignore the continual hardships and dangers to which this cause commits us. It is true that on one level, this explanation, given incidentally to the Pope, is evidently too simple. In the words of J.H. Eliot, the Reconquista was not one but many things. It was at once a crusade against the infidel, a succession of military expeditions in search of plunder, and a popular migration. This southwards migration suited the Queen of Castile, whereas the King of Aragon, for obvious geographical reasons, remained preoccupied with his northern French neighbor. Then there was the question of the restless Castilian nobles. As Queen Tamara had discovered in Georgia, repeated conflicts against foreign neighbors constituted one good way of occupying them and maintaining, perforce, in their loyalty to the crown. But given the millenarian atmosphere of 15th century Europe, following the capture of Constantinople in 1453, and given the devout character of Isabella herself, Prescott called her the soul of this war. The statement of the Catholic kings should never be dismissed by a later age as in itself insincere. "It is very true that your war is just won," wrote Isabella to Ferdinand of his French involvements. "But my war is not only a just one, but a holy one." She made much of this distinction. In 1482, the Christians captured Alhama, southwest of Granada, and from that date onwards there was a series of campaigns as the Moors were stalked through their once proud kingdom by the predatory Spanish tigers. These were stirring days for Christians, particularly those who had long been held as prisoners of the Moors. When Ronda was captured, the filthy and emaciated prisoners who emerged from its dungeons were comforted by the Queen herself. The royal entry into recaptured Mauchline was marked by a solemn Te Deum song in the royal chapter. As the words were being intoned, those present heard faint underground echoes, and it was gradually realized that the dungeons lay somewhere beneath the chapel. In a scene reminiscent of the prisoners' emergence in Fidelio, the Christian captives, long incarcerated in darkness, were led forth. It was helpful, however, that the Moors were disunited by this date. A feud within the family of the aged Nasrid king Muley Hassan meant that the realm itself was split. When Muley Hassan's son, Bobadil, was captured in April of 1483, he thought it worth his while to bow as a secret vassal in order to combat his father, just as while to bow as a secret vassal. Oops. Let me try that again. It's another one of those long sentences here. When Muley Hassan's son, Bobadil, was captured in April of 1483, he thought it worth his while to bow as a secret vassal in order to combat his father, just as Ferdinand, in those negotiations at which he was expert, thought it worth his while to accept the notion of a 2-year truce. Bobadil was a faltering ally at best. At the final siege of Granada in late 1491, it was once again Bobadil who would defy the Spaniards, with various changes of side in between. But his vacillations, beside giving strength to his enemies, enraged his family. His father's brother, the champion known as El Zagal the Valiant, preferred in his turn to surrender to the Christians after the fall of Baza in 1480, rather than to Bobadil. This is not, however, to denigrate the staunchness of the Spaniards. They were obliged to mountaineer as much as fight in stark and inhospitable country, at least in the early stages of the campaign. And if Bobadil was no great general, El Zagal, on the contrary, justified his name by inflicting a crushing defeat on the Christians in 1483. Isabella's own efforts divided, like those of Queen Tamara, into her private strategic contributions and her public figurehead appearances. The latter included the ceremonial occasions, such as that at Seville, when the militia were reviewed in full battle array, with successive battalions lowering their standards as the Queen passed. Isabella was seated in a saddle chair, embossed in gold and silver, borne by a chestnut mule, whose bridle was of crimson satin covered in gold embroidery. At this review, Isabella formally raised her hat to her husband, which meant that her head was still covered by her coif, and the kings bowed to each other thrice. But there are also numerous glimpses of her, splendidly serene and courageous before sieges. It was lucky for her, perhaps, in terms of public display of her person, that the Reconquista was predominantly a war of sieges. The latter created their own mythology, by which the arrival of the Queen was said to spur on the Castilian troops to the extent that victory, previously in doubt, became certain. Her visit to Malaga, for example, in the summer of 1487, came, as it turned out, at the end of 3 months' arduous siege, for on 18 August, Malaga finally surrendered, a turning point in the Reconquista, after which it was doubtful that the Moors could long preserve their kingdom. The arrival of the Spanish mascot, or rather holy figurehead, came to spell doom to the Moors. It was the arrival of Isabella before the walls of Baza, late in 1488, which broke the gloomy news to the inhabitants, led by El Zagal, that the siege was to be prosecuted with renewed vigor. All right, we're on page 194. This chapter goes to 202. I hate that much, to be totally fair, but it's enough for me. There goes that. Person needs to feed herself stuff again. Where's my little paper? Thank you for being with me today. I appreciate you. I will continue at the end of chapter 12, and then we'll be starting chapter 13. Elizabetha Triumphans. 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 I'll look it up. I appreciate you. Thank you for being with me today.